really want to focus on tonight is the purpose of the scheme, the background to the consents, our infrastructure, what's changed in terms of the planned infrastructure versus what we've actually implemented, because that's quite significant, how we've developed the scheme in stages and what that means, what the land use mix is, what was it before Central Plains come into play, and what are we expecting once Stage 2 in Sheffield is developed. I want to talk about the conditions of the consent, and this is where the Salwaihoa process and the setting nutrient limits to farm versus what we had in our consent that was, the decision was announced in 2010 and the consent was granted in 2012. So looking at that, water take, water use, the impact on aquifers and lowland streams, and all the issues around nitrogen. So there's a lot to cover. So just for those who maybe aren't so familiar with the scheme, you'll be familiar hopefully with the Salwaihoa zone. So this is the darker area on the map. Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora down here, foothills, Lake Coleridge here, and the scheme area between Rakaia River, Waimakariri River, the Selwyn runs down the middle, and State Highway 1 here. So it's a fairly significant area, a catchment of around 100,000 hectares. And the consent to irrigate is for 60,000 hectares within that area. So a little bit of background to the Central Plains Water Trust and Central Plains Water Limited. A lot of people don't realise that the consents to irrigate are actually held by the Trust, Central Plains Water Trust. The Trust was set up in May 2000, and the settlers of the Trust were the Christchurch City Council and the Selwyn District Council. It's a public charitable trust, and it was always expected that those consents would be owned by the community, okay? As I said, the consent was lodged in around 2008, the decision was 2010, and it was granted in 2012 once the appeals were resolved. In April 2003, the Central Plains Water Trust was then established, and in June 2003, the Central Plains Water Limited, the company was established to raise money to obviously apply for the consents and then get the farmers on board to actually construct, implement and operate the scheme. There's an agreement, a memorandum of agreement between Central Plains Water Trust and Central Plains Water Limited that licenses the consents for use for irrigation. Okay. The Central Plains Water Limited is a cost recovery model. So it's not a business that makes money out of irrigation. The annual charge that the farmers pay is paying back the debt. It's a 40-year loan that we have from banks to build the scheme, and the farmers pay that back on a monthly basis per hectare. I won't go into the figures, but you're welcome to have those. It's not really the point of this evening's discussion. So it's cost recovery. There's a small charge for administration that covers staff costs to administer consents and what have you. So at the moment, the team at CPW is about 30 staff, and that includes people managing construction, managing operations, delivery of water, managing the consents and all that sort of thing. And the board is made up of 7 directors. So the original purpose of the scheme was to provide a reliable supply of run-of-river water to irrigators. The scheme, as I said, is made up of 60,000 hectares. The consents are granted for that. It was always expected or modelled that about half of that, 30,000 hectares, was already irrigated, and that was groundwater irrigators. And the other half, the other 30,000 hectares, was dryland farm. Okay, so it was expected that Central Plains would provide run-of-river water, and those farmers on groundwater could switch off and discontinue the abstracting from the aquifers and take the run-of-river surface water. So that's the high-level concept of what was in play there. And discontinuing abstracting water will enable the aquifers to replenish, and it would improve the flows in the lowland streams into Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. So why is run-of-river better than taking water from the aquifers? Well, the aquifers are like a big bathtub, a big storage pond, okay? And it's got a quantity of water in there that is replenished when the rain hits the plains and percolates through the ground. And as we know, we haven't had much of that until recently. So the aquifers really drop quite quickly. Run-of-river, on the other hand, the Rakaia and Waimakariri rivers, which the consents relate to, their flows are dependent on rain in the Alps and snowmelt. So we get freshers or high flows in the river when we've got the rain in the Alps, but we can have a drought on the Canterbury Plains. So whilst you can see the irrigators busily going round and round out in the paddocks there, you think, gosh, they're irrigating. But it's actually taken based on that high flows in the river, okay? I'll talk more about how that abstraction is governed from the river later on. So it's a very sustainable alternative to taking water from the ground. The Trust objectives were to not only provide water for irrigation, but to enhance the environmental, economic, social and cultural values across the communities of central Canterbury. And ultimately ensuring that the ownership of the consents was held by the community and it would never pass to any corporate or commercial or overseas companies, so it was vested in the local community. And importantly, the consents require that there's agreements with the farmers that they can't act inappropriately in terms of their use of water. Ultimately, the Central Plains Water Limited can switch off the water if they don't abide by the conditions. So what mechanisms of oversight do the Trust have around scheme operations? Well, first of all, there's the Sustainability Protocol that was established in 2008. And it's actually worth, if anyone's interested, having a read. It's available, I think, on the Central Plains Water website. It's called the Environment Management Strategy now. But that sets out all the activities are to be carried out to a high standard of environmental care, and it's focusing on active management and prevention of problems. Okay, so you can work your way through that around soil management, fertiliser management, stock management, all those sorts of things. Now, how do we bind that to the farmers? When they joined the scheme, they signed up a water user agreement, and that agreement includes the requirement for them to abide by the consents. And that goes right down to the application rate, how many millimetres of water they apply at one time to their farm. And they have to comply with that. Again, if they don't, there's a mechanism in that agreement for the company to switch off the water. At the detail level, we have the farm environment plans and we have the farm environment plan audits that are undertaken annually. So again, there's a detailed level of oversight in terms of what they're doing and making sure they're implementing the good practices that they've set out in their farm plans. And finally, there's the ground and surface water monitoring program, and I'll show you a little bit more about this later. But Central Plains monitors 29 surface water sites and 23 groundwater bores. The groundwater bores are within the scheme area, and the surface water monitoring sites are in the scheme area, above the scheme area and down into the lowland streams and lakes. So surface water sites are monitored every month. Groundwater sites, bores are monitored quarterly. So there's a great detail of oversight there. And we have an independent panel of experts that are appointed, representative from the City Council, Selwyn District Council, ECAN and other independent experts that review what we're doing and the results that we are finding and ensure that any trigger levels which haven't been exceeded, there's strategies to put in place to investigate and work through mitigating if necessary. So here I want to talk about what's changed in terms of the actual scheme infrastructure and what was consented, and then show you what's actually been implemented or currently a work in progress. So scheme area, this black line was the alignment at the 235 contour of the Head Race Canal. So it was to take water, there's a consent for 36 cumecs on the Rakaia River and 24 cumecs on the Waimakariri River. And the concept was the run-of-river water is very low reliability. It's available about 60% of the time. So it's always expected that the scheme would need some kind of scheme storage. Most of you may be aware that there was storage mooted for Wainiwa way back during the consent. That was withdrawn before it ever got very far. So the scheme was consented based on run-of-river. We always knew that somehow we needed to get storage into the picture at some point in the future. We were very fortunate to establish an agreement with Trustpower 4 years ago, to take for them to take our run-of-river water when the river's running high, store it in Lake Coleridge, And when we're on restriction, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, when we can't abstract, they can drop that water back into the river for the scheme to pick it up. So the storage came into play. Headrace Canal, we constructed 17 kilometres, this first portion here for stage 1. I'll talk about the stages in a minute. We're now no longer going to construct the balance of that Headrace Canal. The other thing that's changed is the distribution network that is not shown here was a series of open race channels that were going to, almost like big stockwater races that you see out in the community, they were going to deliver water down the plains to the farmers, not under pressure. They were open, unlined races. So where did we get to? We've got now a series of HDP pipes. That's the high density polythene pipes. I'll show you some pictures of those shortly. They're all underground. There's 4 lines going down stage 1 of 130 kilometres. All you see is the turnouts at the farmer's gate. No leakage. The water's pressurised. It's gravity fed, so it comes through the canal and it goes down these pipes and it builds up speed as it progresses down the plains, and it builds up its gravity. So there's a little bit of pumping up the top here, but it's all gravity fed, so very, very efficient from an energy perspective. Stage 2 is currently under construction. Stage 2 was operational from the 1st September 2015, so we've had 2 seasons now. Stage 2 is currently under construction, and so is Sheffield. It's a smaller scheme, it's physically separate, given its up gradient. The water is taken from the Waimakariri, small 2 cubic intake up here, and a small 200 to 300 litres a second from the Kauai, working alongside Selwyn District Council in relation to their stockwater consent. So that's what we've got underway. Stage 2 we expect to be operational 1st September 2018. So we've got 20,000 hectares here and 4,300 hectares in Sheffield. So this is a better map to look at the infrastructure. Rakaia River intake here, open Headrace Canal. This blue pipe you see running through here, we call it offtake 5. There's currently 4 pipes that come off these white lines. This is the 5th one. So instead of continuing the Headrace Canal through this very tricky downs area to the Waimakariri River, we've got a pipe that runs through, starts off at 2.5 metres diameter. So it's very big. And that's going to be taking all the water required to supply this area here. So we won't be using at this stage any Waimakariri water to irrigate the stage 1 and stage 2 areas. These purple pipes are the HDE pipe network, so this is the same material as the white lines you see in stage 1. And the coloured blocks you see here indicates those farmers that have joined the scheme. In Sheffield, up here, as I said, the 2 cubic intake up near Keens Road area, and just on the corner of Cox's Road and State Highway 73, you'll see a big mound of dirt as you drive past. That is a 2 million cubic metre storage pond that's currently being lined and should be filled late September, early October. So that's the main infrastructure, but very different from what it was consented, a lot more efficient, no losses through leakage, and a much reduced impact from an environmental perspective, in terms of impacting the landscape from construction. Predominantly going through farmers' properties, and as I'll show you in some of the pictures shortly, you're in and out within a matter of days. So just as a close-up, this is the Rakaia River, the intake. You've got a long channel here that takes water. It's an unlined channel from a braid of the river. We've got an overflow channel here that returns water to the river, and we've got gates here. So it has a capacity to take up to 40 cubic. So there's 4 gates, and depending on what we need, 1, 2, 3 or 4 of those gates will be open. This large area is the sedimentation pond, and under this area here, underground, there's a series of galleries, and we call that our fish screen. Okay, so it prevents fish getting from here into the header pond, which then you have the headrace control gate that control the inflow of water into the canal. So it's a very sophisticated, very high-tech, extremely impressive piece of infrastructure if you ever get a chance to have a look at it. It's actually quite amazing. So this is what the headrace canal looked like. It's fully lined, so no leakage. This lining goes under this ballast on the top here. This is an anchor that holds it down. Some ballast on the bottom. It's 25 metres wide and 5 metres deep, so it's massive. and 17 kilometres long. So that was just after it had been constructed prior to filling it with water. Now, I talked about that large 2.5 metre diameter glass reinforced plastic pipe. This is what it looks like. So these are nested, so there's a number of pipes inside. So it starts at 2.5 and I think it gets down to about 1.6 or 1.8 metres at the end of that 23 kilometre line. So absolutely massive. They've been all imported from Adelaide in Australia. And then we have the HDPE, which is the high density polythene pipes, and they're extruded from a bunch of these tiny little plastic beads. They're put into a heated process in these portable units, and it squeezes it out into a nice long tube that then is taken to site and popped in the ground. And in stage 1, some of those lengths of pipe were up to 100 metres long, so very, very impressive operation. You can see this is a smaller pipe. They dig a trench with one machine. Another machine holds the piece of pipe in place, places it. Another machine comes along and pops the soil back on top of it, beds it down. We re-sow the grass and we're out. So many metres per day, 100 metres a day in some instances, or more. In some it was a kilometre, I think, they were doing for the smaller pipes. So some farms were in and out within days. And these are the impressive pump stations. We've got a number of pump stations to, especially up at the top of the scheme, to build that pressure until it gets to a point where it actually takes up its own pressure through gravity. Pressure reducing valves that are dotted around the scheme, and of course these are the turnouts that pretty much is what you'll see at the farmer's gate, and they connect our pipe to their infrastructure on farm. And this is where we have metering in place to see how much water is taken. We can turn that turnout off from head office, so Fiona can look, see what they're taking and turn it off if necessary, and every drop is accounted for. And this is the turnout I talked about, so off-take 5, that connection of the GRP pipe. So we've just made a hole in the side of the canal and we're implementing this very, very large piece of infrastructure, which is quite amazing. Okay, so looking at land use, this is obviously something that there's a lot of anxiety over with regards to new irrigation coming on, and it's all going to be dairy and everyone's getting all upset. So I really want to unpack that and look at what that looks like. So stage 1 at 23,000 hectares, 60% of that prior to Central Plains coming on at the end of 2015, 60% was existing irrigated land. Predominantly dairy support with some arable. So essentially what Central Plains was enabling through stage 1 was a switching off of the groundwater and a switching on to a more sustainable run-of-river supply of water. Stage 2 in Sheffield combined, 24,300 hectares. Pre-CPW, so we're still in the pre-CPW mode, obviously under construction, and we're only just now receiving the farmers' nutrient budgets in terms of what they're planning to convert to. We've engaged with those farmers over the last couple of years, and in the more recent 6 to 8 months, the resounding feedback that we've got from the farmers is that they are arable. There's a history of arable farming, family farms, and they want to stay arable. Okay, so 50% of the land, so about 10,000 hectares, is already irrigated via groundwater. And a lot of it's arable, sheep, beef finishing, dairy support. And about 20% or 5,000 hectares is existing dairy. Now it's important to note here that it's meant to be a 60,000 hectare scheme, but we're only building 47. Why are we doing that? Largely, there's about 13,000 hectares of groundwater irrigators in stage 2. There's a few in stage 1, but mostly stage 2, that have opted not to come into the scheme. They're saying, oh, cost, affordability, farming at the moment's too hard. So they've opted not to come in. So they won't be switching off that groundwater and switching on to a sustainable run-of-river supply. So we have got most of the dryland farmers in, but we have downsized the scheme simply because those groundwater irrigators haven't come in. So what do we expect? Well, we know in stage 1, because obviously we've had 2 years of farming there and irrigating, there's about 7,000 hectare potential for new irrigation. We know we've got about 5,000 hectares of that underway. It's predominantly dairy support is what that new irrigation is, to support existing dairy farms, okay? So 27% or 2,000 hectares, 20% of it was new dairy, so it's not as high as what people think. And there was about 2,000 hectares of mixed arable and stock farm systems, okay? Stage 2, the 20,000 hectares, as I said, about half of it is already irrigated from groundwater. So this is where I've said that the intentions are to continue with arable systems. They want to ensure they have water so they can fulfil the crops they've got to grow various things. At the moment, it's a bit hit and miss because, they might take on a crop to go grow peas or carrots or whatever, but they're not sure that they're able to produce depending on the weather. So irrigation will give them that certainty that they can fulfil those crops. So some of the arable farms have historically included some dairy support, and that will continue. But of the new irrigated land, there's been a very low indication at this stage that farmers want to go dairy, 12%, okay? So it's not indicating that everyone's going to go dairy, but these farmers have a history of growing things, and that's their expertise, and they're not interested in stock. So this is where we're at, and we're working very hard to look at new options, and this, as I said, my new venture going forward is looking at future crops that farmers can grow to make it even more viable. Sheffield, 4,300, mostly dry land arable farming community. There's a lot of potato growing up there and other things. The intention is to continue with that, but again, making with reliable water, they have that confidence that they can grow. It has historically included some dairy support, and that will continue. Okay, CPW's use consent. This is around the history, so we're winding the clock back a little bit here. The use consent was granted in 2012, as I said before. It was submitted, sort of applied for around 2008, and the decision was in 2010. It was always understood that half of the 60,000 hectares was going to be new irrigation. So there was a lot of submissions and evidence, as in any hearing, around how to deal with those additional nitrogen losses in relation to intensified farming. So how was that reflected in the CPW use consent that was granted? It included conditions to manage, monitor and mitigate any adverse effects that should they occur. So what it included a nitrogen application rate, a limit of 200 kgs per hectare per year, and it included limits on drainage concentrations of N. So that was addressed. It required all farmers to have a farm management plan. We now call them farm environment plans. It required those farm plans to be audited annually for the first 5 years, and then that stepped out as the grades got to a point where there was confidence in the management. The sustainability protocol that I've already talked about had to be in place, and that set out the requirements of the scheme in terms of a governance and operations based on sustainable practices. It also requires the scheme to have robust systems in place to monitor and track the scheme's performance and report that to Environment Canterbury. In addition, and this is with regards to potential mitigation strategies, irrigators are levied annually on every share they hold in relation to their water volume. They pay into an environmental enhancement fund. They also pay annually, this is forever and ever, amen, well, for the 35-year duration of the consent at least, into the Tiwai Opora Enhancement Fund, and that totals $320,000 a year. We have just about to implement the first round of biodiversity enhancement planting by Te Ara Kakariki in September. So they were successful applicants to the fund last year. We're about to open that fund up again in the next few weeks. So it's already starting to have a positive effect on, and it's not for Central Plains farmers, it's for wider community initiatives. And of course, I've talked about the establishment of the grounded surface water monitoring program. So all of these were wrapped up into the original Central Plains water use consent. So we know, and I'm sure you're well aware, that in December of 2011, up until that point, the Salwamahora Zone Committee had been working away on the zone implementation plan. December 2011, I remember very clearly coming out to Lincoln and being involved in the first stakeholder engagement meeting. And there's 113 of us in the room from a wide range of the community, from Fish and Game, DOC, Central Plains, other irrigators, the District Health Board, farmers, all sorts of people, iwi, and we all sat down and said, you know, how do you actually implement these priority outcomes that have been assessed? The two key issues of the course were water quantity and water quality. So one of the issues with water quantity was the over-allocated groundwater from abstractions from irrigation. So it was looked at then, and of course in 2011 CPW hadn't started supplying water. That didn't happen until the end of 2015. So everyone was really concerned, well, what if CPW doesn't go ahead? What if it falls over? What's going to happen? You know, what will happen to groundwater? So ECAN did some wizardry modelling and confirmed that if CPW doesn't go ahead, the groundwater consents that the farmers use, their typical annual volume, they will be cut back to 25% or a quarter of what they annually use. So imagine going from growing your crops and what have you with a certain amount of water, and now someone's saying you've got a quarter of that, make that do. And so everyone was like, well, that's terrible. So it was acknowledged then that at least for that particular aspect, there was a huge value in Central Plains going ahead to enable those farmers an alternative supply that they could switch to and resolve that groundwater issue. Water quality, of course, the increasing of nitrates and phosphates in the groundwater, particularly for Central Plains, it was the nitrate issue, and that's what I want to focus on tonight. So how did this process affect CPW? Well, setting nitrogen limits came in the form of kgs of N per hectare per year lost below the root zone. So my first question was, okay, well, we've got an application rate and we've got drainage concentrations in our consent, so how did we do some jiggery-pokery to turn that into kgs of N per hectare per year lost below the root zone? And there was no easy answer to that. It had to be completely modelled based on overseer and farm systems. So it was huge. So our consent obviously didn't measure it in the way that it needed to, but it was, whilst it didn't measure it in the way that it needed to going forward, it was acknowledged that the consent and the process up to granting that consent fully addressed the issues associated with that intensification through that 30,000 hectares of new irrigation. And so we were deemed to be part of the existing environment. So the issue of should we go ahead now or should we not, given this processes in place around setting limits, it was like, we have the right legally, we have the consent, we're under development, we're underway. So it sort of put that issue to bed. But it didn't resolve the issue of, okay, well, our consent isn't reflecting the correct form of how nitrogen needs to be measured. So a load had to be calculated for the scheme, and that was a very big piece of work. So there's a bit of history here, and I won't go through it all because you'll all go to sleep, but we got to the point where a load of just under 2,000 tonnes, 1997 I think, or something like that, was proposed for the scheme. And that was for existing irrigators and for new irrigators. It was all wrapped up in the same bundle. And we were going through a prospectus process at that time, and we thought, this is actually too risky because we don't have absolute certainty of what those farmers who are current irrigators, we don't know their 2009 to 13 baseline because we haven't gone and measured every single one. So there's a real risk that we could end up with those farmers soaking all of that nitrogen up through existing environment, and there's none left for the new guys coming on board. So we said, no, we don't want a scheme allocation. What we want is just an allocation for the new irrigation. Okay? And so we after looking at all of the land area, all of the existing shareholders, what consents they held, we confirmed actually there's 33,000 hectares of existing irrigation, and there was only 27,000 hectares of dry land. So that was one interesting outcome there. But we said, right, the 33,000 hectares or any existing irrigator joining the scheme, they can come under the scheme we supply water, but from a nutrient perspective or a nitrogen perspective, we will just be the reporting body. So they will be, overseer budgets, farm plans, and we are reporting that to ECAN, but they don't get anything. They don't get any additional nitrogen. They are farming as per any other farm. They're limited to their 2009 to 2013 baseline and have to make the percentage reductions from there. So they don't get anything. and they shouldn't have gotten anything. So the load was specifically for new irrigation. So to do this, we thought, we just can't, suck a number out of thin air, and modelling's great, but we need some basis for this. So we went out and we studied 40 farms. There's 12,000 hectares, and we went through each farm and had experts prepare the overseer budgets based on version 6.1.3. And so then we got a real good feel of what the in-loss actually looked like. Got to the point, sort of jumping forward here, we landed on 979 tonnes is what Central Plains needed to convert that 27,000 hectares from dryland to irrigation. That was granted during the consent, during the plan change, and we then went through the process of applying for a consent. It was an administrative process because we already had a consent. It was really just replicating that to the new form, and that was granted in 2016. All the farm plan, the audit, the water quality monitoring, all those conditions rolled over into that, so nothing was dropped out at all. But what I want to point out, before I skip on, what I want to point out here is that 979 tonnes, there's a lot of misunderstanding around that, because 621 tonnes of the 979 is the dryland farming baseline. So whether the scheme went ahead or not, that is already in the farming community, okay? All we needed was 358 tonnes to allow the guys farming here to convert from dryland to irrigation. So that is actually 7% of the catchment load if you're looking at that as a 4,800 tonne load. So, okay, 7% that you could argue, well, it shouldn't be there anyway. But I just want to say, okay, in 5 years' time, well, when we get to 2022, we would have the percentage reductions that we have to make, as all other farmers have to make. By 2022, we would have reduced our load by 413 tonnes. So whilst we've got a little blip, we were raising it by 358, and so that will be really into play by 2018. By 2022, that's gone, it's reduced by 55 more tonnes than we were actually allocated. So you can say that, yep, it's going up, but it's actually going down pretty quickly. Okay, so that's going to be 23% reduction on total. So I think it's a really, really important point to say, well, yes, there is a blip, it will go up, but it's going to go down more than it's actually gone up. And so that's where you've got to look at the balance. Is this really weighing it all up? Is it worth it? Is it worth that extra 7%? Okay, so we've got to look at, once the scheme's fully constructed, we're switching off 100 million, we will switch off around 100 million cubic metres of groundwater, okay? We'll bring around 300 million cubic metres of low nutrient alpine water into the catchment. There's obviously the knock-on effects and benefits to the economy, the social, cultural and biodiversity outcomes that are sought through the zone implementation plan and the plan change. But I think something that's actually really, really important that often goes under the radar is the scheme has the detailed oversight across 380 farms. So we are the mechanism to report to ECAN, makes their life a lot easier. One booklet, one report, one spreadsheet, and it goes right down to the farmers' practices. Right, it digs into the detail, and we know exactly who's doing what, who needs to improve, and importantly, who's doing extremely well, and we're able to celebrate those successes. So having the scheme manage all of those farms is a huge benefit to the community to be able to report on progress. So yep, you weigh that up against, for that 3 to 4 year period, you can see that actually, it's a pretty good outcome. So yes, so the 300 million cubic metres, we know we're switching off we've already switched off 60, it's up to 100 million cubic metres, so it's estimated around 225 million cubic metres of extra water will flow through the aquifers and down into the lowland streams. So I just wanted to show you here what our first year of some snapshots of our first year annual reporting dashboard look like. So we've mapped through GIS all of the irrigator systems that our farmers have. So each farm plan, we get down into the detail. What's your irrigator system? We know that obviously a lot of these were existing, as I've said, about 15,000 hectares of this was existing irrigation. So 75% of the irrigators have the top performing infrastructure, okay? Very efficient irrigation. So that's about nearly 18,000 hectares. Just over 5,000 hectares, we've got of the old, sort of older style travelling irrigators, perhaps not quite as high-tech and as efficient as some of the new ones. And you can see where they are. And we're obviously overlaying their audits and we're looking at their farm practices. We've got that oversight. And our vision is over time that brown colour will turn to green. Okay, so we know exactly what people are doing. We know where they've got the infill spray lines and what have you, micro-irrigation, so we know what everyone's got. We know what the land use is, broken down block by block, and this has come out of the nutrient budget. So we're able to reflect exactly what the farmers are doing through the way they've blocked and analysed their farm. The thing that I really like is this diagram here. This shows every blue line is a groundwater consent held by a stage 1 farmer. This is in the first season, the 2015-26 season, so we literally pushed the button and these farmers with the groundwater consents were like, is it going to work? Are the pipes all going to pop out of the ground, you know? So they were quite keen to hold on to these consents because they wanted to know if the pipes all blew up, then they'd have to have some water somewhere. So some of them held on to them and they used quite a bit of, some of their groundwater. Others, over the season, dropped off their usage. So the blue lines is their consented volume, annual volume. The red lines is what they actually use. So that's where 60 million cubic metres, or 75% of the groundwater, so typically they'd use around 80 million cubic metres, they use 20. So within literally pushing the button on Central Plains, we dropped it right back by 75%. So, you know, when we go back to that, balancing it up, is it worth it? It had a massive effect just by getting us going on that first season in terms of that groundwater usage. So we were extremely pleased with that result. We didn't really know what it would be until the end of the season, but we were actually blown away. What we did see in terms of, did it make a difference to the aquifers? Well, as we all know, the 2015-16 season, it was very low rainfall, and it had been the subsequent years to that. So the aquifers were very low anyway. So switching off the groundwater, what we noticed when we were measuring levels is that bores across stage 1 held the ground, so they didn't continue to drop. Whereas stage 2, where we weren't irrigating, they were still dropping. So the farmers were all saying, okay, it didn't replenish, we needed some rainfall for that, but because they weren't abstracting, it just held the line. And so that's a very, very early indication of potentially some benefit there. Our ground and surface water expert panel say it's too early yet, but it's looking pretty good. We know this year that farmers have also continued to not abstract that 60 million cubic metres. So again, its status continued there. So just on to our river regime, the storage. We've got Trustpower, as I said, takes the water when the rivers are reasonably high, and there's our consented volumes there. Takes the river, water, pops it into Lake Coleridge. And so it's certain, so the total of this season, 15-16 season, we took 91 million cubic metres of water, okay? During that period of time, we had 18 days when the river was on full restriction. So the levels had dropped to a point where we could take nothing. And a lot of our farmers were like, oh my God, that means I can't take anything. I'm like, no, you can take a full supply of water because we can dial up water from Trustpower and get them to pop it in the river, and a number of hours later you can take it. It took the farmers a wee while to get their head around that. They thought that the scheme being on restriction meant that they couldn't take water. They're all across that now. We had 84 days when the river, we were on partial restriction, so we couldn't take our full take. And we had 152 days when we could take our full take. So this is the benefit of stored water. If we hadn't had that stored water, for nearly 100 days, the farmers, and that's a long time, 100 days, farmers wouldn't have been able to irrigate much, or if at all. Okay, so the benefit of the storage meant they could keep going. So just in terms of how the river hangs together with regards to consents and where Central Plains sits in that, this is a wonderful drawing of the Rakaia River that doesn't look anything like the Rakaia River. But what we're trying to demonstrate here is that the old system, or the way that consents work, water was allocated in bands. And CPW got what was historically called Band 5. So it sits up the top. And it's the first one to get cut off. So while we have a significant chunk of water, it's only available about 60% of the time. Okay? And then as you go through, as the water levels in the river reduce, you've got band 4, which is Barhill Chertsey, band 2, 3, which is individual irrigators, and then band 1, which you've got highest reliability, is never cut off, is your stock water takes. And then you've got the Rakaia River WCO minimum. So in order for, it's a 1-for-1 take, so for the 70 cumecs here, therefore there needs to be 100 cubic flow required in order to take the full 70. Okay, so just wanted to demonstrate why we need storage, because essentially this is cut off, as you saw, for 100 days in that first season. And this is a little diagram that shows our demand, which is sort of about 8 cumecs through here. And there's obviously a lot of water in the river, and there's sometimes when there's not. And so the brown, orangey areas show when we've got demand and there's no water in the river, we dial up the water from Trustpower, they drop it in and we can pick it up. So you can see there's often a lot of water, but it's not at times when we need it. Okay, and that's where Trustpower, or when we can take it, so that's when Trustpower can take it for us. And obviously we've got issues if there's a big fresh and there's a lot of sediment load in the river, we shut down the gates and take nothing because we don't want that sediment into our infrastructure. Okay, on to our ground and surface water quality monitoring. I just put some maps in here to show you the breadth or the extent of the area we're monitoring. So this is the surface water sites, there's 29 sites, all through the scheme area and into the lowland area and in the lake as well, up country in the foothills. So we're measuring that every month. We've got a water scientist who's full-time at CPW and has been on board for about 5 years. And he goes out, he's pretty much almost full-time out monitoring water. Quarterly, he goes out and he does all of the groundwater bores and reports that. And they are predominantly within the scheme area. And they've all been put down, they're all sampling bores, fully screened, so they're not just someone's, irrigation bore. So we've got our data, we had to have this in place 2 years prior to starting taking water. So this water monitoring program, the baselining of it against existing nitrates and what have you, that had to happen some years before we actually got underway, so that we actually knew what the levels were, and we were able to measure our performance against that or any effects going forward. So this is the parameters we test for. It's a wide suite covering all the key areas of concern. What we've noticed, and I'm not a water quality expert at all, but what our scientists tell us is that the nitrates in the bores for 3 to 5 years prior to 2015 bounced around up and down within a particular band or range. And that has continued. So there's been no trend of it going up or down outside of that range. So it's fairly consistent. We know that this is a sort of a long game around changes to water quality, so we're expecting to see not a huge change for a wee while. It's going to take some time to see some changes, and we're looking at positive changes here. We have noticed some spikes or incidences of E. coli, but predominantly in stage 2. And we've talked with the Canterbury District Health Board, and they said, look, do you measure it straight away again after you've had a spike to make sure that it's gone back down? And we said, well, we don't have to, but yeah, we'll do that. So now if there's ever a spike, we're back out there within a week or two to re-measure it to make sure it's gone down, and we inform the households and what have you if there is a spike. And obviously stage 2 isn't receiving CPW water yet, but we're still upholding that request from the Health Board to make sure that we report that, which we're happy to do. In the ground and surface water panel, they review our annual material, which we're about to submit at the end of August, early September. At the moment, they're saying there's no specific evidence of any changes caused by CPW. So obviously that's something that is a long-term game of keeping an eye on. But all this information is submitted to ECAN. It's all publicly available, and you're welcome to request it. So we talked about the zone committee and the priority outcomes a bit earlier, and this is an ECAN diagram. And it talks about a whole bunch of things. Biodiversity corridors established, thriving and prosperous communities, all communities in Marae having access to high quality drinking water, flows restored in lowland and spring-fed streams, coastal biodiversity enhanced, water quality standards, mahingakai values protected, efficient on-farm water use, etc., etc. So there's storage, management plans, braided rivers protected. So these are the things the community want, and we all were part of that process. We've gone through this, and I'm not going to talk about it today, but it is at the back of this presentation. I've got a little schedule of all of these things and then what we've given effect to through our consents. And it's a good read, because to a greater or lesser extent across all of these things, we've been able to have a positive impact. And I think that's a huge testament to those who drafted the consents many, many years ago, having the foresight to put conditions in place that allowed us to cover most of these things, including opening Lake Ellesmere a number of times a year, contributing to the cost of that. So there's a number of things that, you know, are sort of right outside the actual scheme area that we actually contribute to. What are the benefits we've achieved to date? Well, we've had 110 farm environment plans implemented prior to September 2015. These have now all been audited during the 2016-17 season. The target that the Zone Committee set was that those irrigators need, 75% of them need to be at good management. Over 90% of those farmers are at good management practice. So that's really something to celebrate. And they have really been through the grill about what they're doing. So we're very confident around those. They were all audited independently as well. So they weren't audited by the scheme. As I've said, 60 million cubic metres of groundwater was switched off in that first season, and that's remained the same for the subsequent season. Biodiversity enhancement program is underway, as I said, scheduled for September, and the Year 2 fund opens shortly. Other good news is that we've been working closely with ECAN over the past year, I suppose, or more, on we've got this amazing piece of infrastructure that's been put in the ground. How can we actually utilise that infrastructure to benefit the environment and the community even more? So we've just been granted funding to implement a turnout at the Selwyn River to augment the river, and obviously that will flow down into the lowland area, up to 3.5 cubic. So it would be a big valve that you can open to whatever extent you need, depending on what water is required. And there'll be a lot of monitoring around that to measure what it's required, when it's required. But that is a massive, massive contribution outside of delivering irrigation. But the irrigation infrastructure has enabled this to be put in place. During the design phase, we undertook a suite of ecological, archaeological, heritage assessments right across the scheme. Lizards, flora, fauna, you know, all sorts of things to identify where these hotspots were. And then we went back to the drawing board and instructed the engineers to avoid putting pipes and pumps and infrastructure anywhere near these things. So it meant we were able to work around and protect those existing features in the landscape and the heritage, which I think has been pretty amazing. And that's again something that nobody sees or nobody really knows about. We also know feedback from the local communities in Horata and Darfield that they've had a real boost during particularly the construction. You had 150 odd staff with the Downer and Fulton Hogan during the construction of stage 1, and Downer currently is about 300 odd staff in stage 2, and another 100 odd in Sheffield. So there's a lot of people in the community requiring food and all sorts of things. So there's a real boost to the local economy. And it has had some lasting benefits with other little businesses that have popped up to support farmers going forward. We've had reports that it's boosted the role of schools. You might say, how has it done that? A lot of the farmers said, you know, they were about, in terms of farm succession, dad handing it down to sonny Jim or daughter Barbara, who decided actually, without irrigation, we were going to leave. We're going to go somewhere else. But with irrigation coming on, they could see a future and they could see that farming would be viable for their family. So it's great that those local people have stayed on in the community. The really exciting, which goes under the radar, is our Sheffield scheme. It's a real wee gem with regards to what we've been able to do to take on board wider community benefits. We've been working closely with the Selwyn District Council. We're implementing pipes to take water to the 2 drinking treatment stations, so the raw river water. One of them currently in Sheffield is taken from groundwater, and there's some issues there with contamination. on and off, and some are taken from the Kowai. So our pipes will now deliver that raw water to the treatment stations, and that provides future proofing for the community. So they know, no matter what happens to groundwater, they've got a reliable supply of water going to their treatment stations. We're also piping under pressure stock water to farmers. So that's another real benefit there. Providing water to the 110 stage 1 farmers, delivering under pressure, meant that 4 megawatts of electricity could be discontinued. So the farmers that were, pumping from the ground, it's a lot of electricity, that's been switched off, which is great. And again, I've already said, the fact that we've got oversight over all of those farmers, potentially up to 60,000 hectares in the future. We know their practices, we know the nitrogen loss, we can look at how they're reducing that loss over time, and we're able to review that performance and provide that transparent reporting to ECAN and the community, I think is a significant benefit to the wider, community of Sal Waihora. So yeah, there are cons. There is a con. 7% extra load in the catchment for about 3 or 4 years. The big pros are switching off that groundwater, the fact that we're managing the clawbacks of nitrogen, managing farm management with the farmers, and having that visibility and transparent reporting to the community. So thank you very much.